What is it that makes Josef Hofmann the greatest pianist of all time? A combination of things. A golden tone, certainly, but also a unique use of the pedal. And this, I've always wondered why, even after 100 years, more than 100 years, his use of the pedal has never been imitated by anyone, with the possible exception of Glenn Gould, I guess, a little bit. Glenn Gould was definitely influenced by Hofmann when he was a young boy. He heard him play and so forth, and was very moved by the concert. But this was not a secret. His use of the pedal was not a secret, even in his more than 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago. Olga Samarov wrote a whole article about how Hofmann used the pedal and explained the whole thing. I mean, this is well over a century ago, and yet no one has imitated it. So you had the golden tone, you had his use of the pedal, along with his use of the pedal was an understanding of musical density, an understanding, and not even an understanding, but an acceptance of the fact that the human ear can only hear or enjoy so many voices polyphonically. In other words, he realized the limits of the ear, how many polyphonic voices the ear can hear and enjoy, and he didn't fight against it. He accepted it and gave the ear what it wanted. So you had the golden tone, the use of the pedal, along with that, an understanding of musical density. But then all of the other items as well. I mean, his finger work, his passage work, his fiatura, the way that he played trills in a most unique way. I mean, his trills, just one of his trills. I'd rather almost listen to one of his trills than the entire recordings of other pianists. Not all other pianists, but you have the trills, you have the passage work that was so even. You listen to his recording of La Campanella or any of these other things, and again, this was spoken of and talked about, obviously. So definitely the golden tone, the use of the pedal, the understanding of musical density, the finger work, okay? And his fingers, in terms of just virtuoso speed and octaves and thirds and so forth, certainly there was no other pianist who had a bigger technique than he did. Not Godowsky, not Levine, not Rachmaninoff, not Horowitz, not Bachhaus, not Friedman, not Kissin. I mean, they all did things extremely well, but we cannot say that any pianist had a bigger technique than Hofmann. Along those lines also, so leaving that aside for a moment, Hofmann had an understanding of rhythm that was unique and powerful. This is in the whole book of Abe Chazin's. He talks a lot about this, and he dedicates a lot of pages to this, okay? Hofmann had a very strong understanding of rhythm. And we see that in recordings, for example, the recording he made of Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu. I don't know any other pianist who would attempt such a rhythmic treatment of that piece, and not only in the first and the third sections, but also the middle section. And of course, we hear that also in the way that he plays with orchestras. Very remarkable, very strong. Whereas even great artists, other great artists who play with the orchestra, Tigerman and so forth, you'll find times where they're just not with the orchestra. I mean, it happens to the best of them. So yeah, these are the things that made Hofmann so great. I mean, his obviously his infallible, musical memory, the sheer amount of pieces that he had memorized and could play at will. We all know about those things. I mean, he played 10 concerts in a row. I believe it was in Kiev. Back-to-back, night after night. He played 256 different works by memory. And also, what I love about Hofmann is he had a unique approach to music. It was always interesting, and along those lines, it's not only that he always had a unique approach to everything, whether it was the Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 or Chopin Nocturne. He always had a unique approach with Beethoven, Beethoven sonatas. I mean, no matter what it was, he had a unique approach, and so that always was very much appreciated by the listener. But along those same lines, speaking of his unique approach to music, I would like to say that he often there were more than one Hofmann. So, and we even have recordings from his tours, live recordings of his tours, and sometimes you listen to something like the Berceuse of Chopin one night, and then the next night, completely different interpretation. And I think that's probably why I'll probably end this little broadcast by speaking of the different Hofmanns that we find. If you listen to the test recordings he made, for example, of Chopin's third, the B minor sonata of Chopin, the first movement, and of course these were test recordings, so you listen to them, and sometimes he'll just stop playing right in the middle of a piece. But even though he just sat down and played a little bit of it and then he stopped playing right in the middle of it, still we would rather listen to that test recording than any other pianist attempting that piece. And he just sat down and was testing out the sound. But in any event, if you listen to the test recording he made of the B minor sonata of Chopin, that's what we call Hofmann the aristocrat. It is a pure rendering of the piece. It is just pure, clean. Great artists have listened to it and they've almost said it's almost too clean. And the independence of the hands in that piece is remarkable. You listen to it year after year, decade after decade, and it's just absolutely marvelous. Very clean, but interesting, and the golden tone and so forth. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, that was the test recording, but you also have when he was an old man on his celebrating 50 years since his first concert in America in the Metropolitan Opera House, so the golden anniversary and so forth, where he was like 65 years old or something, around that age, 62, something like that, where he, they stuck in secret little recording devices into his piano. He never knew that he was being recorded. And yet we hear the playing, for example, of the 1938 Casimir Hall recording of the Chopin Fourth Ballade. That is not the aristocratic Hofmann. That is the wild animal, out of control Hofmann. And I think David Duvall was not right about everything, but I think he was right when he said that in that recording of the Chopin Fourth Ballade, Hofmann makes the piano do things that the piano should not be able to do. His conception of the piece, the way that he brings out the inner voices and so forth. And of course he did that really as well as anyone. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, you listen to, for example, the Rachmaninoff prelude, da 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 dee da da dee 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 dee, and the independence of the voices and the hands and the subjugation of the accompanying passages. I mean, Hofmann was second to none when it came to that. But going back to this fourth ballade, for example, he was just the conception. It's like listening to Anton Rubinstein, how he must have been. The conception is beyond anything I've ever heard by any other pianist. I mean, there's just no, I can't think of anyone who even comes close in that piece. The way that he does the phrasing and the way that he does the overall architecture of the entire piece and the octaves and the arpeggios, everything that happens. The thirds, listen to the double thirds in the coda of that piece. I mean, it's just beyond anything. Dubal was right about that. In that piece, Hofmann makes the piano do things that the piano shouldn't be able to do. And of course, there are other wonderful recordings from that same concert that are just marvelous, and I could speak for a long, long time about them. Whether it's, I mean, Schubert or Beethoven or all the other things that he played, and of course the live recordings from the radio of the Chopin Concerti are just absolutely marvelous. The way that he approaches the fiatura passages and so forth, and it's just, we could go on for a long time about every single recording that we have. And what's interesting, of course, is that the recordings that we have were not, almost without exception, were not planned. They were stolen recordings from either the radio, or someone stuck a recording device in his piano without his knowledge, or in some cases his wife saved some recordings from the radio and she put them in a safe place, and we were able to discover them later on. These are all, none of these were, I shouldn't say none, very few of these were commercial recordings. And yet, I think we can say, even though we would have liked to have heard a lot more recordings of Hofmann, I think we can say with certainty, we have enough. We have enough to verify what other pianists said about him. We have enough snippets, even though the sound quality is often very poor and so forth, and some of the recordings are only half complete because they were test pressings. We have enough to know. Now we know what these people like Rachmaninoff were talking about. Now we know why even someone like Horowitz, who of course was a great pianist, but he also had severe mental issues and was very arrogant and so forth, and that was his downfall, of course. But even someone like Horowitz, when he first came to the United States and he was in this Steinway basement and he saw that what the person told him was Josef Hofmann's piano. And even Horowitz, as arrogant as he is and as many problems, mental problems as he had, and he went over and he said about Josef Hofmann's piano, "Can I just touch it?" He was begging the person if he could I just touch it? So we know what was said and written about Hofmann, but we have enough snippets from the recordings to verify, those of us who know what to listen for and so forth, even though the sound quality is often very, very poor, we have enough. We can verify what was written about him. There's no question it was correct what they said about him. Well, as Anton Rubinstein, who hated prodigies, child prodigies, and yet he took the little Hofmann prodigy because he was just beyond anything anyone had ever seen. Anton Rubinstein called him the greatest musical genius the world has ever known. And as I've said, these little recording snippets that we have, whether it was placed under the piano without his knowledge or whether it was taken off the radio, it's enough. It shows us that he was beyond, without question, the greatest pianist of all time.